They were robbed of their ethnic culture from Africa. When they were brought here as slaves, they were immediately culturally alienated. The first thing that white slave masters did was implement a rule forbidding black people from engaging in preserving their cultural traditions, most likely because they didn't feel that black people were entitled to the sort of basic human right of preserving culture.
One thing I really hate on YouTube channels, and one thing I really hope to avoid on my channel specifically, is people going after low-hanging fruit. People taking the next outrage that we see in the news, the next crazy thing the left wing has done, either in the universities or in the media, and giving it a send-up, just like everyone else does. Making a video decrying how insane the modern world is, but not really communicating any kind of understanding, not letting the users really see why this is going on or anything more about people they disagree with. But there is something I love more than I hate low-hanging fruit, and that is taking something that we all consider low-hanging fruit and looking at it from a different perspective, in some sense steel manning the argument, to see what the real emotions are, what the possible truth might be behind people who are making this argument or who are participating in this, what would superficially look like a ridiculous cultural complaint or a ridiculous cultural trend, to see what they're really saying. Is patriarchy theory really as ridiculous as every college freshman makes it sound when they start their own YouTube channel, the way that every bedroom feminist explains it? Probably not. I mean, there are a lot of very intelligent people who believe and teach this stuff, so there must be some kind of argument behind it that could at least deceive people into thinking that it's correct. But looking back at the events that really stood out in the culture war since I've been away from my YouTube channel, a few things have really stood out as being sort of egregious examples of low-hanging fruit, of left-wing and culturally progressive insanity. And the ne plus ultra of the low-hanging fruit that I saw was none other than our perennial boogeyman, cultural appropriation. Now, recently, cultural appropriation has returned to the news because of a ridiculous and insane incident where a professional blogger essentially called out a 17-year-old high school student for wearing a Chinese dress to her prom. And of course, the objection was predictably ridiculous. The dress in question, a cheongsam, doesn't even have any traditional or spiritual significance. It's a product of the early 20th century, and didn't represent very much more than a modernization of casual wear that came from the previous century. In many ways, the cheongsam incorporated more elements of Western design than it did anything having to do with traditional Chinese culture before contact with the West. And of course, because of the explosion of outrage, every single anti-SJW had to make a video of this incident. It made an appearance on Sargon's This Week in Stupid, and of course Roaming Millennial, due to her Chinese heritage, made a very extensive video outlining the ridiculousness of cultural appropriation, at least in this context. And of course this is quite predictable. Cultural appropriation has been the weak bolt in the quiver of progressive complaints for 1 or 2 decades now, and every time it comes up in the mainstream media in a major way, there's sure to be almost more firebacks by the anti-SJW side of the argument than there are going to be people defending it from the pro-progressive or pro-SJW side of the issue. Looking at the responses that generally accompany accusations or issues of cultural appropriation, I even get the sense that the left is embarrassed of this. Sure enough, given how discourse and authority is divided up on the left, the objection can't be taken off the table altogether. But sure enough, where there are usually quite robust defenses of things like patriarchy theory, of things like the wage gap, of things like systematic racism, cultural appropriation is something that most of the intellectual defenders of the left really don't like to confront. And that's for the simple reason that the complaint and issue is patently ridiculous and insane. Here, I'm just going to repeat in brief the objections you'll get from any anti-SJW channel you care to frequent, from Sargon to roaming millennial on down. Everyone who's serious and who has seriously studied culture understands that cultural creation comes from sharing, from remixing, and there isn't a single element of literature or design that we can look at that is designed by one culture in isolation from all others. To erect some kind of moral boundary around a culture generally is to essentially say that we think it's immoral to try to learn, to try to produce new things. And it would reclassify most of the things that we know and love from the past as artifacts of cultural theft. Theft of one culture over the other in almost every single case we can imagine, including the Cheongsam, the dress that originally sparked off the controversy. And I get the sense that at a deep level, the left realizes this. Even ContraPoints, who's sort of known for making passionate defenses of pretty much every crazy idea that comes out of the left, had to do a lot of walking back on this concept of cultural appropriation. Of course, he wanted to defend it, but he understood he could not defend objections against cultural appropriation in the way that objections against cultural appropriation are usually made. He couldn't come out and say people who use out of context culture or who borrow indiscriminately from cultures they don't fully understand are being inappropriate and insensitive and evil. Because, well, I mean, the left's been doing this for 50 years now. But nevertheless, cultural appropriation is the left's word and it has to be defended. So what ContraPoints does in his defense of this is he walks it back. He says, well, what the left objects to is not really cultural appropriation per se, the taking of culture by outsiders for repurposing and remixing inside a different culture in totally different contexts than the original. What we're objecting to is the use of cultures to mock the people who made them. Cultures essentially being turned on their heads. There are some prominent examples of this. Most prominently in the American imagination certainly is the minstrel show, a depiction of African American culture for the purposes of mocking African American culture using elements of African American culture that were taken from real life. ContraPoints goes on to label this not cultural appropriation, but cultural humiliation. And sure enough, this is a shitty thing to do, and something that people should avoid doing to other cultures if they can possibly help it, even though the left is quite comfortable doing this to rural American Appalachian white cultures, but we won't go there for now. This is not a call out to leftist hypocrisy. That's getting to be low-hanging fruit at this point. Suffice to say, cultural appropriation can make sense. It can be sort of rehabilitated in the ContraPoints way. We can say, we're really not worried about the remix taking away something, stealing it, depriving it of its cultural roots. Remixes are still good. Postmodern art where we take things out of context, it's still good. That's the basis of the remix culture as it existed since the 80s, is still good. What we're talking about is the malicious expression of hatred for certain cultures using that culture's own symbols. And that makes a lot more sense. It makes a lot more sense. It's totally legitimate. We should all listen to people who say that we shouldn't do that. But the explanation of cultural appropriation as being cultural humiliation is total bullshit. It's total bullshit, not because it's not true, not because it's something that we shouldn't care about, because it's manifestly not what the people complaining about cultural appropriation were trying to communicate initially. What people like ContraPoints and the other white academics who try to explain cultural appropriation do is create a simulacrum of the objection that makes sense to them, that makes sense to their ability to try to sell the initial objection to cultural appropriation as a fixture in the progressive movement towards equality and the melting down of all normative cultural features and the march towards the one world. In that context, cultural humiliation has to be either the true meaning of cultural appropriation objections or their true source. But I think if you look at actual minorities, actual people from minority cultures and from the third world who are making these objections, aside from the first world charlatans, and there are a lot of first world charlatans in this group, you'll see that the white progressive explanation of this is not accurate. They do in some sense mean that the inappropriate use of their own cultural symbols in some ways demeans them and makes them less powerful. They actually do mean that the reuse and recontextualization of their symbols actually detracts from their original power. But of course, how can we even take something like this seriously for the very reasons I laid out at the start of this video? Superficially, it seems to contradict our entire notion that everything can be remixed, that cultural artifacts can be taken out of context and there's no harm done. Taking this objection seriously poses a huge problem for the modern liberal Western mind. But taking this objection seriously poses an even more difficult objection to the modern progressive mind, to the modern egalitarian post-cultural mind. Because locked away in the genuine objection to cultural appropriation is the distinctly reactionary and pre-modern opinion that symbols and cultural artifacts have their own intrinsic meaning and their own intrinsic worth, that they point to transcendent realities that are outside our own ability to consume things. The problem with cultural appropriation is not that it's the latest iteration of mindless, rootless, and tasteless cosmopolitan progressivism. The problem with the current objections to cultural appropriation is that they fundamentally are dishonest. Cultural appropriation is the sterilized, whitewashed, and sanitized version of what at its root is a fundamentally reactionary emotion. The belief that one's culture has transcendental meaning, and that transcendental meaning needs to be protected. One of the last conversations I did before my unofficial and quite regular spring hiatus was a conversation I had with the YouTuber Bronx Blogger. Now, I like reaching out to the left. I think it's very, very useful. And in some sense, Bronx Blogger has become one of my favorite hard left-wing voices on YouTube. And it's a channel that I hope to come back to again and again. And it's for the simple reason that I think the guy is really genuine in his perspectives. And this is something that has become increasingly common on the left. There is this tendency to sort of issue front page apologetics. Very staid, very much reading from the script. And, I include in this even people like ContraPoints. Now, ContraPoints is somebody, and I wish I had thought of this, but it comes from Millennial Woes, who really should, in their intellectual capacity, be called Talking Points. Because that individual almost never strays off the progressive reservation as far as their thought is concerned. Every video, without exception, is not an opinion, but the opinion, the progressive opinion. And you will just not get dissent between ContraPoints and another vlogger, like, say, for instance, a Christy Winners or a Three Arrows. ContraPoints videos are obviously incredibly scripted because there's a large dimension of performance art to them. But the more damning thing is that the opinions are really highly scripted. And you see this even in smaller channels like Three Arrows that have a much lower budget production. In this instance, I could tell you all of the opinions that they have on any given topic just by seeing the title. There never is any mystery and there is never a new take. But that's very different with Bronx Blogger, because I feel that when Bronx Blogger sits down and makes a video, he's actually speaking from the heart. He may not have exactly figured out where he stands on any given issue, but sure enough, he actually is giving a reaction that in the moment is true to what he believes. It's less scripted, it's more raw. And so I was quite encouraged to see that this week Bronx Blogger had released a video about just that, about cultural appropriation. And this revolved around, strangely enough, a parody video. A parody of Donald Glover, or Childish Gambino, as he is called by his rap names, video, This Is America. Now, to provide some context, This Is America is a video that came out, I think, about 2 weeks before the release of this video. It largely is just a rap music video with a lot of call-outs to current events and particularly violence in the Black community. Now, although I think the hip-hop song itself is rather uninspired, Childish Gambino's music video, This Is America, went super viral almost instantly. And the buzz was really driven by the left side of the media. And it's pretty easy to see why if you watch the music video. It's just more or less a collection of the general objections the progressive movement has been making about the conditions of the black community for the last 40 or 50 years at this point. Mix in a little bit of progressive ideological self-flattery and hey, you've got a hit. But I think it's fun to note that as popular as this video is and was in the last few weeks, it's explanation videos. The videos released by almost every single major progressive news outlet explaining all of the deep symbolism in the images shown are almost as popular as the initial music video itself, which I think that tells you something. But that's neither here nor there, because the subject of Bronx Blogger's video focused on a parody of this initial work. A parody by a progressive called Nicole Arbor, who is, I suppose, a bit of a celebrity, a kind of pop feminist of sorts, and who decided to do a takeoff, a send-up, perhaps even a tribute to Childish Gambino's This Is America, replacing more or less the imagery having to do with the African American community and their special grievances of the African American community in the 21st century with, well, what else in the era of identity politics? The grievances that the women's movement has in the 21st century. Something that probably would be pretty expected given the overwhelming popularity of the original work, and something that has a lot of precedent. If you know anything about progressive online culture, you know that send-offs and tributes and repeating things in slightly different contexts for a different identity group is all of the rage, and frankly, I'm surprised that anyone is surprised that something like this wasn't made even a few days sooner. But regardless, I was very interested to hear why Bronx Blogger found this particular send-off or parody so objectionable, and indeed at the end of the day it did come down to the initial topic of this video, cultural appropriation. And of course, Bronx Blogger laid out all the typical objections. The parody was crass, it contained none of the quote-unquote power of the original, although as I said, I didn't find the original to be particularly inspiring or fresh. It was more or less just a rehash of progressive perspectives on race that have been said again and again ad nauseum in the other media forms. But at any rate, sure enough, the critique stands that this was absolutely a derivative work and totally uninspired. But what surprised me is that after all of these objections were made, Bronx Blogger goes on to make an even stronger case. He feels that the existence of this cultural artifact was deeply damaging to him and to other people like him at a very deep emotional level. He calls it cultural parasitism, and he has no shortage of harsh words for Arbor or any of the other white progressives or conservatives who stick their small noses into the affairs of the African American community. And I took that to heart. If one listens, one can hear the anger. And of course, as Bronx Blogger goes on to explain his emotions about this, he ends his video with an impassioned plea to have some space that he can tell interlopers, other cultural forces, to just stay out of. A place where his own sacred symbols cannot be intruded on. A place where he can communicate his truth and practice his spirituality and his exercise of meaning in a way that befits him. And I think it's worth it just taking a look at Bronx Blogger's own words here.
Liberals and conservatives alike, through the mechanisms of capitalism, stick their little noses into the black community, where a lot of the art is a byproduct of decades and centuries of suffering, a hard-earned, hard-won identity, a black identity that was built from nothing, from being given nothing to building a coherent black identity, and to never ever be able to say to white people, do not pass this point. Give me this. I mean, you've had this in your interpersonal interactions with everyday people. Sometimes people turn to you and go, just give me this little bit of space, this little bit of boundary. And it challenges white privilege to turn to a white person and go, no, you may not.
And when I heard this, all of the pieces of the puzzle started fitting together. It's odd enough, but this video, how it ended with Bronx blogger essentially pleading for some space that is, in a sense, culturally reserved for African Americans. This very plea was exactly where my conversation with him ended a few weeks earlier. I had asked him in a conversation about how the left and the right could cooperate, whether in his ideal society could a cultural group essentially create their own space and their own separate piece. And when I brought it up in the contexts of white nationalists and black nationalists and Quakers and Catholics, Bronx blogger was incredibly skeptical. He seemed to think that any desire for some kind of separate piece away from the integrated whole was some nefarious plot to perhaps concoct a state that could destroy the larger society and the peace of other people. And so I was surprised to see in this video him essentially arguing for the exact opposite case, him arguing for my position, that as a Catholic, I should have the ability to create a separate space for people of my common spirituality to practice their lifestyles in a way that they saw fit. Something that was very hard to see in the context of Catholicism when I brought it to him in our discussion was very easy for him to see in the context of an art representing African American struggles against oppression. And so I set about wondering how I could resolve this contradiction in Bronx blogger's thought process. I respect him as a thinker. Sure enough, there is one opinion that is his true opinion. There is one value that is supreme in his mind, either the desire to integrate all peoples into an undifferentiated whole, or to have areas where people can practice things in isolation and in cultural homogeneity, with the assurance that their own symbols will not be intruded on. And this gets us back to the heart of what is cultural appropriation, and the fact that the most fundamental thing about cultural appropriation is that white progressives don't understand it. As I am always wont to do, I will quote Robert Conquest in saying that we are all conservative about the things that we love. But in this case, I think I should say we are all reactionaries about the things that we truly love. And that certainly applies to Bronx blogger, because I think that he truly loves this artifact. Not just the Childish Gambino music video, but really what it represents, what's behind it. The narrative of the struggle for liberation, that in some sense is his religion, and he truly values it. All this notion about the necessity of total integration of all cultural aspects and the fact that we can't have anyone breaking off and making scary, separate communities, that's just the boilerplate that, if I may be so bold, Bronx blogger has been taught to repeat because he's associated with the political left and he's been in contact with white progressivism. But no one actually believes that, and no one actually really wants it. The idea that we would enter a world where all cultures could just be homogenized and molded into the common market is a nightmare. And Bronx blogger himself brings this up when he reminds us that, well, the real forces at work with cultural appropriation aren't malice, but just capitalism and laziness. Bronx blogger loves something, and when he loves something, he understands why he wants to preserve it. And he wants to preserve it away from integration and homogenization. And I think in light of this, we can finally come to a respect for minority peoples or third worlders who cry about cultural appropriation. In some sense, it's very legitimate. It's something that white people and indigenous Europeans complain about as well. The fact that the things we had and valued in our culture are now being consumed by a globalistic culture who just wants to slap them on a lunchbox and sell them. The fact that many of our sacred symbols that people of previous generations died for are now just corporate logos. And that's sad. I mean, you can call it blasphemy if you want to. You can call it cultural appropriation. But in either way, it's still a tragedy. But okay. How does this, though, square? I started off by saying that the objection of cultural appropriation in its strongest form was insane and ridiculous and couldn't really realistically be entertained. And I pointed to this as the reason that white progressives in many ways are hesitant to defend it, even though they'll defend more ridiculous concepts at the drop of a hat. If I consider that these objections about cultural appropriation come from a legitimate emotion, is there no way to express this emotion? How does this square with the belief that everything at the end of the day culturally is a remix and recontextualization? I think in order to understand this problem, we have to start by understanding the problem of modernity, in that the modern world that we live in, dominated by consumerism and global corporations, is not the world that most people's ancestors grew up in. In many ways, even for technological man, it's a very alien place. We are used to sort of a sphere for ideas and consumption and thought and experiences all being this conglomerate market. We get our inspiring ideas from television and from movies, which are produced by the same corporations that fund our universities, which produce the same kind of globalist diversity cosmopolitanism that is followed in corporate America and in government, and through our interactions with all of these systems, all which have more or less similar cultures, we obtain the consumer products that we use, we obtain the food that we eat, we get the money we pay for our children's education, and we also get the inspired messages brought to us by Kleenex and the Hallmark Channel. It all comes from the same place. It all comes from the common market. There are no boundaries. The boundaries have all been torn down in the 20th century. But it didn't used to be like this. In human history, people's desire to get authority, people's desire to get transcendence, people's desires to get consumption, they didn't all come from the same place. There was the homestead, there was the marketplace, there was the magistrate's office, there was the city hall, and there was the temple or church. And each of these places were very, very different places with their own set of boundaries and their own set of rules. And this allowed people to have separate concepts of things that were sacred and profane. The marketplace and the public square were rowdy and dirty environments where people could mix it up, where people from all different places could come and mix things up and actually have mixture of ideas and exchange of information in a place that we designated as being reserved for those purposes. But at the same time, the marketplace and the public square were kept out of the temple and the cloister. And in the places of the temple and the cloister, the civilization and the peoples who occupied that civilization would obtain their transcendence, their quiet, and their contemplation. Moreover, we kept both of these spaces separate from the homestead, where we raised our family and insulated them from many of the dangers of the world in their most delicate years. But of course, post-industrial revolution, post-globalization, the notion that we could keep these things separate is quaint and stupid, and now we've essentially crammed all sorts of human institutions into one giant arena, and everyone is confused, angry, and scared simultaneously. We are left crying for safe spaces and crying for free speech, not really being aware that freedom of speech and safe spaces could be guaranteed if we could only create separate areas of the culture to express those desires. A place where we could keep the sacred and the profane separated. But of course, thanks to poor decisions made in the last century, and thanks now to the continued existence of white cosmopolitan progressivism, everything has to be liquidated and homogenized. The white progressives want no separations of any kind, and when their third world and minority allies start complaining that their own sacred symbols are getting trampled on, they have to recast this as a complaint about oppression, when it really is just a standard emotion that all humans feel and should have respected. When I see minority voices sort of get swept into white progressivism and progressivism generally, I always feel like I want to warn them to run, to get away from the ideology that will inevitably destroy whatever they hold sacred. Because at the end of the day, I do think what Bronx blogger is talking about is an idea of sacredness, an idea that something has to be held above the fray of mixing, selling, and exchange. And this was even more emphasized when, as Bronx blogger ended his monologue about cultural appropriation, I began thinking to the recently held Metropolitan Gala, which had essentially a bunch of socialites And cosmopolitans dress up using symbolism of my own Catholic Church in the most tasteless and tacky way. Now, I'm a person with a pretty thick skin when it comes to having their cultural sensitivities offended by what mindless celebrities do. Nonetheless, there is just this utter sense of profanity when I saw what they were dressing up as, and I think it's the same profanity that Bronx blogger is reacting against. In some sense, the culture war is truly tragic because I think that the divide between left and right prevents us from seeing common causes. People like me and Bronx, and probably a lot of other people on the left, feel the need for sacredness very distinctly, in a way that I think people like ContraPoints and other white progressives really don't. There's a need to be bigger than ourselves, to reach for something that's transcendent. And the more and more I think about the culture war, the more I think that this isn't a struggle between Christian souls and Muslim souls, or progressive souls and conservative souls, or black souls and white souls, but just among people who believe in a soul and people who want to essentially obliterate it. And as dark as that may seem, I am comforted that there are people on the progressive side who still feel something, who still feel a need for some sacred space, and some reach for the transcendent.
I think that cultural parasitism is much more accurate than cultural appropriation. If anything, I think cultural appropriation is too polite for the kind of pilfering and exploitation that happens when, and again, it's not as simple as, Kim Kardashian wears cornrows. This is wholesale theft. This is replacing somebody in the marketplace and defanging, because what something like this does is it defangs the message of the original video. So Nicole Arbor can make her fucking video if she wants. But I don't understand, and again, this applies to general cultural parasitism. The white man and woman are entitled to, take something that is sacred to you and to your people and sell it as a costume, sell it as a commodity to take your culture and pimp it. Is incredibly destructive to social relations. And again, cultural participation can be done politely. Sure, cultural participation can be done politely, but you should, again, the whole point of being polite or respectful to other cultures is sort of to let the people of that culture let you know where the boundaries are and where they feel comfortable with you participating.